It's interesting. Let's get into it. What were your initial thoughts on the kickoff?
I mean, my thoughts were from this game, we didn't really see much. So obviously, we got to see it in practice for the first time in terms of what exactly the new mechanics are going to be. For anyone that hasn't watched, the XFL, this is like your first sort of look at what this system is going to be. In terms of like the creativity or what it's going to do to the play and all those kinds of things, you saw almost none of that from this game. Now, you did get to see it's going to result in kick returns again. Like that's, I think, the one practical result that we did see. The kick return is back in terms of we will see kicks returned again. The kick return is yet to be back in terms of anything useful coming from it, because it was like they just ran it as it's drawn up, on a spreadsheet somewhere.
Yeah, so I was trying to like really break it down and understand it, get a feel for how it's going to work. We were talking a little bit off air, and as I was describing it, you were saying, "Hey, maybe they're not showing anything."
Yeah.
So take this with a grain of salt, and then you explain why maybe they're not showing anything, and it's going to look completely different during the regular season. But my initial reaction, right, both the offense and defense are almost right next to each other. They can't move until the ball gets caught by the kick returner. And the idea was that it was supposed to be kind of like a running play. We'll talk about that in a second. But to me, it was like the return team was retreating, and it was almost like they were pass blocking. So they were retreating backwards like they would on an old school kickoff return. And then the kick team, it was almost like you're in pass protection more than anything. And the return, almost in like an air raid wide split type of set. So the kicking team has a lot of room to maneuver, and you're essentially trying to pass block in a line. And pretty much every single kick return had one or two guys got by their blocker, and they made the tackle, and that was it. And so there wasn't anything really, no real big eventful plays on the kickoff returns. Guys like Colin Johnson made some nice plays. He had a really nice tackle. So what I was thinking was, if they treat this like pass blocking, do they start putting offensive linemen out there that have some length and some agility, some athleticism on the return team? Do they start to do that? But as we talked through it, you were saying, hey, maybe they're just not showing anything, and they will have some designed running plays, and it will be the return team more attacking the kicking team rather than retreating once we get to the regular season.
Yeah, I think you have to hope that, because at one point during the game, I was sort of tweeting, it almost feels like the returners are they trying to find the first unblocked guy. They're just running to contact.
But there's but there's no blockers there anymore.
But they weren't even trying.
There's no blockers in front of them. They're way in front of them.
Right, but they weren't trying to attack the edge. They were just running in a straight line towards the first color they saw on the opposing team and getting tackled straight away. Like, it didn't feel like anything was happening other than this is just the play we need to get through. So hopefully, once we hit the regular season, we'll see significantly more creativity and actual design to the return game. For the moment, it almost felt like they're just trying to sort of get reps on what it looks like to be able to analyze it, study it. Like, it almost felt like this was the control for the league to have tape on it, right? This has all been a theoretical construct until now with, training camp reps and stuff. Now here's half a dozen live reps for you guys, NFL special teams coordinators. You're welcome. And then we'll figure out what to do with this.
See, the reason why this is important, Sam, again, as I'm watching it, I'm thinking there's some special teams coach out there, like whichever special teams coach or team generally that finds the right skill set that meshes with this new style is going to have an advantage. And so I think there's some team has this figured out at practice, and they might not show anything during the preseason.
Right.
But it's going to get creative. I think they're going to get creative with personnel. I think they're going to find it, because it's a different skill set. It's a completely different skill set than the old kick return. And I don't know if there's an equivalent on any other special team, punt return, punt on either side, right? On the punt team or the return team, the old kickoff return or the kickoff team. The kickoff team, there's some similarities, obviously, but it is a completely different skill set. So I'm really interested in how the return teams kind of build their personnel, use their personnel, and try to scheme it up a little bit and get to some trickeration and finding the edges in the rules here.
And even in this, like you did see two different approaches in a couple of ways. I think both teams had two return men back instead of just the one guy, like essentially dividing the field in half. But I forget which way around it was. The Bears, I think, always had the same guy return, right? Whereas the Texans would have whichever side the ball went to, essentially,
the old left and right
return man.
Yeah.
I forget which way around that went exactly, but one team would have whichever side the ball went to, that's the guy that would field it. The other guy turns into the blocker. The other team had them offset slightly in terms of depths, and no matter where it went, the guy that was closer to the blockers remained a blocker, and the return guy returned the kick.
The one other thing to mention here, remember last year we did talk a little kicking, we did talk a little special teams last year, and at the end of the season you get fewer touchbacks, right? So the end of the season in December and January, because of the weather, you do get fewer touchbacks and you get more returns back in the old game. That'll be true in this as well. So this is one of those things that as the season goes on, it'll actually be even more important.
Oh, it's going to evolve. I mean, right away. So from that tape, you would say the incentive right now from a kickoff team is hang it up at the goal line, let them return it. They're so bad at doing this, we can tackle them like inside the 20-yard line, and we get great field position. After a couple of teams bust off a return touchdown, like a couple of teams are going to break something out that's actually difficult to stop, and all of a sudden you're dealing with a real risk that this is a significant play for them, and it's going to either score or set them up in great field position. Now the incentive shifts, and you're trying to boot the ball at the back of the end zone and just let them take it at the 30. And then potentially that shifts again when it becomes more difficult to do that late in the season. I think it potentially shifts what you want from the kicker as well. I mean, remember a few years ago, teams would have a designated kickoff specialist. Like it was actually a roster spot. They would have the field goal guy, Vinatieri, late era Vinatieri, who had no kind of leg anymore, but was automatic from 45. He could stay there as the field goal kicker, and then Pat McAfee was the kickoff specialist as a punter. Now the Colts were able to save the roster spot because he was also the punter, but there were teams out there that had genuinely a guy whose only job was kicking off.
My 99 Jags did that. Right. Mike Hollis was the field goal kicker. They had Steve Lindsay as the kickoff specialist. That's all he did. Yeah. They had two kickers on the roster.
So that had kind of died off in the last few years because the kickoff had died off. But now I'm wondering if that...
And because they're kicking off from the 35, so it is easier to get the ball through the end zone.
So I'm wondering now if that becomes a bigger thing again, if teams actually want that kickoff specialist, and maybe these guys, like the Tig leader guys, who can all apparently hoof a ball from 70 yards out, not necessarily always, automatic, but does guys like, Charlie Smith right now with the Saints. Every couple of days, there's a highlight of him kicking like a 65-yard field goal. Now, one day he'll be 7 for 7, and the next day he'd be like 500 in terms of field goal kicks. Like, does he actually have a chance of sticking on the roster more because he's as good a kickoff specialist as you're going to find now?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think if you're the best team, we talked about this with Dr. Eager when he was here, before he was with the Panthers. If you're the Chiefs, special teams should just be like, never turn it over.
Right.
Just don't do anything stupid. And the more non-special team snaps that you have, over time you're going to win more games because you get the best team. So Niners could think the same, right? The best teams in the league, to me, should think of special teams as like, just don't screw it up. Don't turn it over. Don't muff a punt. Don't fumble a kickoff. Don't don't return a kickoff to the 15 when you could have had it at the 25 with the touchback. So just don't screw it up. And I still believe that to be the case for the best teams. It's the underdogs that I'm interested in if they start to think about different strategies, or an aggressive Dan Campbell, even though he has one of the best teams. Are they just going to be like, hey, we're going to find a way to manufacture extra really good field position with these things?
But I also think for the first time in a while, this dramatically increases the scope for screwing up on special teams. Like what this does is introduce a totally new thing, and now
the benefit though too, because there's more,
so there's
one
a
busted
huge
gap and it's a touchdown.
There's a huge benefit to teams that want to dump resources into this, want to get creative, want to get experimental. But that, I agree with you. I think for a number of years now, the goal, the tenet for a good team has simply been don't, like, your special teams creep back toward average, right? Your special teams just cannot be a catastrophe. Anything north of catastrophe, it's fine. Even if it's not as good as other teams, it's cool. It doesn't matter.
Remember the Packers, Rodgers last couple of years.
And they've been right on that borderline, right, of borderline catastrophe. Now, though, it's not going to take much for if you're not great at this, if you have a couple of plays here or there, you could screw it up and you give up 2 kick return touchdowns and you lose 2 games. Like that, I think it massively increases the scope for a team who doesn't really put a ton of resources into special teams to suddenly for that to manifest as a major problem.
So as I said earlier, I think there's a lot on special teams coaches here. Finding the right skill sets for both the kickoff and the kick return and getting creative. And I can't wait to see the creative. I will be watching kickoffs this year once the regular season starts.
Wow.
I will. Unless they become boring. Unless we're overrating this. But I think it's interesting because I think there are team building decisions in there. I think there's probably a certain type of linebacker or blocking tight end that is going to be really valuable in this world who wasn't as valuable in the old kickoff world.
I think there's a whole world of them now. There's what type of players do we want on the kickoff team, the coverage team. There's, as you said, what type of players do we want blocking? Do we actually need to start experimenting with offensive linemen with, does that change the type of players that are sticking on as those designated sort of special teams places on the roster? There's the question of the kickoff specialist. Does that mean you're more likely to buy in or keep a kicker on the roster, even if it's not a designated spot, my kickoff specialist? Are you more likely to want to keep a field goal kicker who has an absolute cannon for a leg, even if he's less accurate than the other guy, because of what he adds to the kickoff game and at least your potential to be able to boot it at the back of the end zone if you want? The kick return game, does a guy like Louis Rees-Zammit, the rugby player in Kansas City, has he got a greater chance of sticking on the roster because of the creative options he brings you in as a kick returner, right? Immediately. I mean, Mike Tomlin has now sort of come out and said this directly. The very second this happened, they went and signed Cordero Patterson. They're like, we have a new fluid influx situation that nobody really has a great handle on. We're going to get the greatest to ever do it as a kick returner, not punt returner, Devin Hester, people. We're going to get the greatest to ever do it, a guy who knows what he's doing in this situation, and he, as much as anything, is going to determine, what our kick return sort of package looks like this season.
Hall of Famer Devin Hester.
Yeah.